I used to think generosity could fix everything. That money, when given freely, could soften the edges of resentment, erase small cruelties, make people kinder. It was naive, that old, hopeful part of me that believed love could be purchased with effort, that respect could be coaxed from silence by one more gesture, one more sacrifice. So when I planned the anniversary trip for Brian's parents, I told myself it was love. It wasn't guilt or obligation or performance. It was love, pure and intentional. I wanted them to see me as family, to see that I belonged. Savannah felt like the right place for that illusion. Warm light, cobblestone streets, the kind of southern charm that looks like forgiveness if you squint long enough. I booked the best hotel I could find. Riverfront view, private veranda, champagne waiting on ice. Then I layered on everything else. A carriage ride through the historic district, a private bourbon tasting, and a dinner reservation that cost more than my first month's rent after college. $6,500. I didn't flinch when I signed the receipts. I told myself it was an investment. Not in them, not even in Brian, but in the idea that I still had a place here. The first 2 days were almost perfect. His parents were polite in that distant, rehearsed way people are when they're waiting for a moment to reveal what they really think. His mother, Elaine, complimented the hotel. She even thanked me. 3 words, short and mechanical, like reading a line from a script. Brian was relaxed, or so I thought. He laughed at all the right moments, held my hand in public, played the part. Looking back, I realized the performance wasn't mine alone. On the final evening, we dressed for dinner at an iconic restaurant in the old district. All soft lights and jazz murmuring in the background. The air thick with money and pretense. Elaine wore pearls. Brian wore that navy jacket I'd bought him last Christmas. The one he said made him feel like himself again. I didn't know then what he meant by that. The wine flowed too easily. Laughter filled the table, but it wasn't connection, it was choreography. I felt it in the way Brian's father kept glancing at Elaine, waiting for cues, in the way Brian's smile seemed borrowed from another man. Still, I played my role. I laughed. I toasted. I reached for his hand when the waiter cleared the plates. Then, with a quiet sigh and no warning at all, he said, "I think we should get a divorce." The words didn't land at first. They hovered there, unreal, until Elaine spoke. "Well," she said, smiling faintly, "I was wondering when you'd come to your senses." Her tone wasn't cruel. It was casual, dismissive, like she was commenting on the weather. Her son had just detonated my life in front of her, and she treated it like a long-delayed chore finally completed. I looked at Brian, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a joke, but he didn't. He wouldn't even look at me, just kept tracing the rim of his glass with his thumb, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the candlelight. Something inside me, that fragile, desperate part that still believed in fairness, cracked. Not enough to shatter, not yet, but enough to know the damage was permanent. I remember Elaine turning to me with that soft, pitying smile. "Monica, dear, you've always tried so hard, but you have to understand, some things just don't fit. You've been very generous, but you were never really one of us." It's strange how betrayal can sound so polite. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just sat there, staring at the tablecloth, at the flickering reflection of the chandelier trembling in my untouched wine. Somewhere nearby, a piano started playing, slow, mournful, almost cruel in its timing. When the check came, I reached for it out of instinct. $6,500 for the trip. $248 for the dinner. A gratuity that could have fed a family for a week. I signed my name with a steady hand, left the pen on the table, and stood up. Elaine looked surprised. "Where are you going?" "For a walk," I said. My voice was calm, steady, almost peaceful. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." And then I left. Outside, the air was thick with humidity and jasmine. The city glowed softly under street lamps, couples laughing in the distance. I walked without direction, past the old squares and iron gates, past tourists snapping pictures of places that never betrayed them. My heels clicked against the cobblestone, small, deliberate sounds that kept me tethered to the earth. By the time I reached the hotel, something inside me had settled. I packed my suitcase slowly, folded every dress, zipped every compartment. No tears, no rage, just precision. The kind of calm that only comes when the last illusion finally dies. At the front desk, the clerk smiled politely as I handed over the key. "Checking out early, Miss James?" "Yes," I said. "I won't be returning." She wished me a pleasant evening. I almost laughed. I sat in the rental car for a long time before driving away, my hands resting loosely on the wheel. I could still hear their laughter from the restaurant, or maybe I imagined it. The sound followed me down the quiet streets until it became something else entirely. Silence. An hour later, the phone began to ring. Brian first, then Elaine, then the hotel. I didn't answer any of them. I watched the calls come and go like waves crashing against a cliff that no longer eroded. When I finally opened one of the messages, it was short, panicked. "Monica, what did you do? The hotel says the payment didn't go through. They're demanding another card. Please call me. This is serious." I stared at the screen until the message blurred. Then another came. "Elaine, this time. You can't just walk away from your responsibilities. Be an adult. Fix this." I turned the phone over, face down on the passenger seat, and watched the city lights pass like fading memories in the mirror. For years, I had been the one who fixed everything, the one who paid, soothed, explained, apologized. I had mistaken endurance for love and self-erasure for virtue. But that night, as Savannah slipped away behind me, I realized something I should have understood long ago. When you stop paying, you stop existing. And if that's all your place in a family ever was, a balance sheet masquerading as affection, then disappearing isn't cruelty. It's reclamation. By midnight, I was already miles outside the city. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't turn it over. The night road stretched ahead, quiet and endless. I rolled down the window, felt the wind against my face, and let the last remnants of their voices scatter into the dark. Somewhere behind me, the hotel clerk was asking for a new card. Elaine was demanding explanations. Brian was realizing that every comfort he'd taken for granted had a name attached, mine. And me? I was finally done pretending that generosity and love were the same thing. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was leaving the bill where it belonged. Morning arrived gray and airless, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. I woke in a roadside motel outside Macon, still in yesterday's clothes, the scent of bourbon and salt on my skin. My phone lay face down on the nightstand, silent now. I almost wished it would keep ringing. At least panic had sounded alive. Silence meant aftermath. I brewed the kind of bitter coffee that tastes like punishment and opened my laptop to check work messages. Routine always steadied me, but the first email waiting wasn't from work. It was from my lawyer, Rachel, subject line, "Urgent. Call me immediately." I called. Her voice came through low, controlled, the way doctors speak before naming a diagnosis. "Monica, I've just been contacted by opposing counsel. Brian's filed preliminary paperwork. He's claiming partial entitlement to your accounts." "My accounts?" I asked. "They're in my name only." "He's arguing marital contribution. He says most of your assets accumulated during the marriage, that he managed household duties while you built your business." The laugh that left me wasn't laughter at all. "Managed duties? He hasn't folded a towel in years." Rachel exhaled. "He's also requested an immediate freeze, pending evaluation." I felt something sink inside me, deep and cold. "A freeze on my funds?" "Yes, we'll contest it, but you need to check your balances now." I hung up and logged into my banking portal. The screen loaded slow, stuttering, as if hesitating to tell the truth. Then the numbers appeared, smaller than they should have been. 10,000 missing from checking. More from the joint investment account. Transactions authorized by a name that no longer felt real. Brian H. James. For a moment I just stared. I thought of every receipt, every trip, every dinner I'd covered while he nodded, grateful, harmless. The trap had been set long before Savannah. I'd simply paid for the decorations around it. I drove straight to the bank, the highway a blur of white lines and disbelief. The manager, a kind-eyed woman named Diane, guided me into her office and closed the door. When I showed her the withdrawals, she frowned. "He came in yesterday afternoon," she said. "Said you'd agreed to transfer funds into a temporary account for property division." "He lied. I figured something felt off," she whispered. "He looked nervous. But his name's on the joint account, so we couldn't refuse." Her apology was genuine, but apologies don't fill empty balances. I thanked her, collected the printed statements, and walked out into sunlight so bright it made me dizzy. In the car, I opened Brian's email on my phone, an old password he'd never changed because he assumed I trusted him too much to check. Inside, the truth waited in plain text. Threads with his mother discussing timing, receipts for the anniversary trip labeled final phase, messages to an attorney outlining ways to protect assets before announcement. They had rehearsed my ruin. The shock passed quickly, replaced by something steadier than rage: clarity. Betrayal is chaotic only until you see its blueprint. Then it becomes math. I forwarded every message to Rachel, each one a line of evidence, then sat back and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen like a pulse returning to life. When it was done, I whispered to the empty car, "No more paying for lessons they refused to learn." That afternoon I drove home, not to stay, but to face what remained. The house looked smaller, shabbier, stripped of illusion. The flower beds I'd planted were dry, the porch light burned out. Inside, the air smelled stale, as if grief had been living here while I was gone. I walked from room to room, taking inventory of what was truly mine. Not furniture, not jewelry. Proof, contracts, receipts, tax files, everything that told the story of who had built this life and who had merely lived inside it. I stacked the folders neatly in a box labeled reclamation. When Brian's car pulled into the driveway at dusk, I didn't hide. He walked in smiling, the kind of smile people use when they still think they control the ending. "Monica," he said, "you shouldn't have left like that. We need to talk about practicalities." "Practicalities?" I asked. "You mean the money you stole?" His smile thinned. "Let's not dramatize. You emptied the accounts. I took what's mine. What's yours," I said evenly, "was built with my hands." He tried charm first, soft voice, tilted head, that boyish plea that once fooled me. "We don't have to fight. My mother thinks we can handle this privately." I laughed then, a sound so raw it startled even me. "Your mother handled plenty already." I read the emails. For the first time, he looked afraid. "You went through your correspondence?" "Yes." "I forwarded it to my lawyer and the bank. You should prepare for a fraud inquiry." He took a step back, shoulders tightening. "You wouldn't, Brian," I said. "You taught me exactly what I'm capable of." The conversation ended there. He left the house without slamming the door, which somehow felt crueler than if he had. The sound of the engine fading down the street was the sound of weight leaving my chest. That night, I sat on the living room floor surrounded by papers and silence. Every bill, every plan, every receipt I'd once filed under love now reclassified itself as evidence. Betrayal looks different on paper: tidy, dated, notarized. I wasn't a victim. I was an accountant reconciling loss. When Rachel called again near midnight, her voice carried something fierce beneath the professionalism. "We have enough to countersue," she said. "And the emails show collusion with his mother. That strengthens your case." I closed my eyes. "Good. I don't want revenge. I want closure that sticks." "You'll get it," she said. "But for tonight, try to rest." Rest. The word felt foreign. I sat by the window watching rain start to fall, streaking the glass like faint handwriting. The world outside moved on, indifferent, unbroken. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured, low, promising. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a life not built on damage control. A life measured not by how much I gave, but by what I refused to lose again. I turned off the lamp, let the dark settle around me, and whispered the sentence that would carry me through the fight ahead. They built a trap, but I still hold the map. The first morning of the fight smelled like rain and paperwork. I woke before dawn, brewed coffee strong enough to taste like resolve, and spread the evidence across the kitchen table. Printed emails, transfer slips, the statement that looked like a confession in numbers. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. Inside, I could finally breathe. Rachel arrived at 8 sharp, a leather briefcase in one hand and the calm expression of a woman who has walked through many fires and come out intact. She glanced at the piles of paper, nodded once and said, "We'll start with containment. No sympathy, no small talk, just strategy." Exactly what I needed. Containment meant freezing his access before he could move anything else. By noon, she had filed an emergency injunction, each signature a boundary drawn back around my life. The judge approved it the same afternoon. Brian's accounts were locked pending investigation. For the first time in weeks, I felt time working for me instead of against me. Then came the countersuit. Fraud, misappropriation, emotional damages. Words that once belonged to headlines now belong to me. Rachel explained every clause in plain language, translating fear into instruction. "We stay factual," she said. "You don't need anger when you have proof." I repeated that sentence like prayer. The next few days blurred into motion. Calls from investigators, digital forensics, quiet conversations with accountants who spoke in decimal precision. Each document I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of oxygen. I stopped checking social media. I stopped checking his messages. The silence became less about pain and more about focus. On the 4th day, Rachel called with an update. "The financial probe turned up something unexpected," she said. "Your husband wasn't just drawing from your accounts. He's been transferring funds from his father's business too." I gripped the phone tighter. His father's company? Yes. Small withdrawals at first, then larger ones, roughly matching the dates of the trip payments. "It looks like he funded your own betrayal with stolen family money." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Does his father know?" "Not yet," she said. "But he will soon. The auditors are required to notify him." That was the moment the story changed shape. It stopped being about me versus Brian and became truth versus everyone who had looked away. When the news reached his family, the silence broke like glass. His father called first, his voice low, furious, embarrassed. "He used company accounts?" I could hear papers rustling, the sound of a man realizing his trust had been pawned. "We'll be pressing charges," he said. "You'll have our cooperation." By evening, the investigation widened. Elaine, the mother who had smiled through my humiliation, was questioned after her emails surfaced. Rachel showed me the printouts, coordinated travel bookings, references to After Savannah and Phase 2. Each line felt like déjà vu in ink. Betrayal documented in polite punctuation. When the case went public, I expected to feel exposed, but what I felt instead was clean. My name wasn't the scandal. It was the evidence of survival. Journalists called. I declined every interview. I didn't want spectacle. I wanted closure. Weeks passed. Hearings, affidavits, more forms. The courtroom smelled of paper and air conditioning, the kind of sterile space where truth feels procedural. Brian sat 2 tables away, pale, eyes darting toward every new exhibit Rachel introduced. Each document was a mirror he couldn't look away from. His lawyer tried charm, then pity, then silence. None of it mattered. Facts don't flinch. When the ruling came, it was almost anticlimactic. The judge's voice was measured, deliberate. Restitution of misappropriated funds, transfer of all remaining marital assets to the claimant, injunction against further contact outside legal counsel. Words simple and final, yet they felt like thunder rolling through my ribs. The gavel struck once. Balance restored. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a clear, impossible blue. Reporters waited at the steps. Microphones like we *P***NS aimed politely. I kept walking. Rachel caught up beside me, her tone softer now. "You did everything right," she said. "I just told the truth," I replied. Eventually it listened. That evening I drove home to a house that no longer felt haunted. The front door creaked the same way it always had, but the sound no longer carried accusation. I poured a glass of wine, opened the windows, and let air move through rooms that had been shut too long. Papers still covered the dining table, yet the chaos looked purposeful now, a record of endurance. I sat among them, writing checks to rebuild what mattered, donations to a legal aid fund Rachel recommended, an advance payment for counseling, a new savings account titled Future Monica James. Small acts, practical ones. Healing disguised as bookkeeping. Later, as dusk stretched across the walls, I thought of the first night in Savannah. The laughter, the toast, the perfect choreography of deceit. I tried to summon anger and found none left. Only distance. The kind that lets you watch a past self moving inside a story that no longer fits. The investigation into Brian's finances continued without me. His father's lawsuit eclipsed mine, a larger storm swallowing the smaller one. When headlines appeared weeks later, local entrepreneur accused of defrauding family business, I didn't read beyond the first paragraph. I already knew how it ended. He would repay what he took, lose what he valued, and learn too late that some debts aren't monetary. What stayed with me wasn't triumph but quiet certainty. Justice hadn't arrived in flashing lights. It had arrived in forms, signatures, procedures, slow, patient mechanisms designed to rebuild order. And maybe that was the point. Chaos unravels quickly. Truth rebuilds methodically. That night, I stood on the porch watching rain start again, soft and steady. The air smelled of wet earth and relief. For the first time since Savannah, I wasn't calculating, explaining, or defending. I was simply standing still, proof that balance can return after collapse. I whispered into the dark, not as a curse, not even as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. I paid the bill. Now it's theirs. When the court papers were finally stamped, the clerk slid them across the counter as if handing over a receipt. I stared at the embossed seal for a long time. It didn't look like victory. It looked like closure printed in gray ink. I tucked the folder under my arm, walked out into late summer light, and realized that silence no longer sounded like punishment. Sounded like space. I moved to Asheville 3 weeks later. A small house on the hillside, white siding, a porch that caught morning sun. Enough quiet to hear my own thoughts again. The first night I slept there, the air smelled of pine and rain. No marble floors, no polished furniture. Just peace that didn't need to be purchased. I woke before dawn and watched fog crawl up from the valley, the horizon slowly taking shape. For the first time in years, I wasn't waking to obligation. I was waking to possibility. Unpacking took days, not because there was much, but because I touched every object before finding it a place. Each item carried a story. The cracked mug from my first office, the framed photograph of my parents, the worn leather journal that had followed me through depositions and nights of insomnia. I kept them not as trophies but as evidence that I had survived without losing the quiet parts of myself. Rachel visited once, driving up from Atlanta to deliver the final documents in person. We sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the air sharp with autumn. "You did everything by the book," she said, handing me an envelope. "Full restitution. Property in your name alone. Case closed. Case closed." I whispered the words, half disbelief, half prayer. For months my life had been footnotes and hearings, each day built around other people's timelines. Now the sentence had an ending. After she left, I drove to the small bookstore downtown and bought a blank notebook. On the first page I wrote a single question. What will peace cost me now? The answer came slowly, written across weeks in uneven handwriting: patience, humility, forgiveness, but not the kind that lets people back in. The kind that lets you keep walking without turning around. I began volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic financial literacy to women rebuilding after divorce. The first class met on a Thursday evening in a church basement that smelled faintly of coffee and determination. I told them my story, not the tabloid version but the quiet version. The lesson of learning where generosity ends and dignity begins. One woman cried. Another took furious notes. After class she said, "You make it sound survivable." I told her it is. The foundation came next, small at first, just a name on paper. The Ledger Project. A fund for women caught in financial abuse, offering legal consultation and emergency grants. Rachel helped with the filings. Friends from the firm offered pro bono hours. Within months, we had our first case. A nurse whose partner had drained her savings under the guise of shared expenses. Watching her sign her first independent lease felt better than any verdict I'd ever heard. I realized empowerment doesn't echo like revenge. It hums like restoration. Occasionally, Brian's name surfaced in the news. The investigations into his misuse of company funds dragged on. Each article shorter, less sensational, as the world lost interest. I stopped reading after a while. Indifference was its own kind of freedom. I didn't need to track his consequences. They no longer belonged to me. Elaine sent a letter once, handwritten, neat cursive on ivory stationery. "I hope you can forgive us," it began. I read it twice, folded it back into the envelope, and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness didn't require an answer. It only required absence of hatred. And I had already achieved that. Evenings became rituals. Music low, windows open, a glass of wine and the hum of crickets rising from the woods. Sometimes I caught myself waiting for the sound of another voice, another key turning in the lock. Habit, not longing. Healing doesn't erase reflex. It teaches you to breathe through it. One night I drove out to the Blue Ridge Parkway, parked at an overlook, and watched the mountains fade into dusk. The horizon looked endless, but not in the way that frightened me anymore. I thought about Savannah, the chandeliers, the announcement, the humiliation polished into civility. It felt distant now, like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. The woman at that table had believed generosity could keep love alive. The woman watching the sunset knew generosity without boundaries is just self-erosion. When the foundation received its first large donation, a quiet investor who'd read about our work, I threw a small gathering on the porch. Volunteers, new friends, neighbors. Laughter spilled into the yard, unforced, unpaid for. At one point I stepped back, wineglass in hand, and looked at the faces around me. They weren't family by blood or marriage, but by choice. That difference meant everything. Later, after everyone left, I sat alone beneath string lights that swayed gently in the wind. My phone buzzed with another notification, press inquiry, probably. I turned it face down. The world could tell whatever version it wanted. I was finished performing. The quiet stretched around me, soft and complete. I thought about the ledger I once balanced with money and sacrifice. Every column had finally evened out. I owed nothing. To anyone. I whispered to the night, "This is what freedom sounds like." And in that stillness I believed it.